Thomas Sowell teaches us about social justice when we come back. All right. Well, happy Saturday, everyone. We are right on the cusp of Resurrection Sunday. And so we're glad to be joined by these distinguished individuals. We got Adam Coleman of True ID Apologetics Ministries. We got Pastor Brandon Washington in Denver, Colorado. And we also have the Apologist in Detroit. How you gentlemen doing?
From the Gotham City Police Department.
All right. Isn't it also where RoboCop was supposed to be as well, even though they shot him in Dallas?
RoboCop was in Detroit. This is Batman, so this is New York. Gotham.
Okay. Well, you're from Detroit. That's my whole point. You confused.
No, for sure. Don't tell nobody, even though it's in my name. Even though it's in my name, don't tell nobody where I'm from.
Don't tell nobody.
I got you, Doc. I got you.
I'm a sovereign citizen.
Well, every time I'm joined on here by Pastor Brandon Washington, I always have to recognize that we have a fellow Texan on here.
Right.
So we got D-Town in the building.
You do. I live in a city where it snows in April and May now, but I'm born and raised in Dallas, where snow is a rare occasion. So I'm trying to.
Nobody knows how to drive.
Yeah,
you feeling real disoriented.
Yeah, I don't know what to do with myself.
All right, so we're gonna get right to it. I wanted to get all of you guys together, and Phil Fox could not be with us today, so everybody just please keep him in him and his family in your prayers. He's tended to some pressing issues that he's taking care of, so we'll just be praying for him and the family. But I wanted to get all of you together for quite some time, maybe even years. I think I was introduced to Pastor Brandon Washington when Pastor Jerome Gay brought him on to talk about being the first time I think it was talking about Thomas Sowell. The second time I seen him on Pastor Jerome Gay's channel, they were talking about being a social justice warrior. I spend too much time on YouTube as it is. I need to spend more time reading and not looking at YouTube. But I came across originally Biola's YouTube channel, and where the host had Sean McDowell on, and they were talking about this wonderful new book. Could somebody hold the book up? All right. Social Justice Fallacies. My book is in my backpack. I'll grab it.
I have a digital copy. I was looking for my tablet, but for the record, I have read the book.
It's talking about social justice fallacies, written by the one and only Thomas Sowell. And I would imagine that soon after the great economist Thomas Sowell is as soon as he transitioned, he'll still be putting out books like Tupac. I would imagine that that's what's going to happen, and people will still be eating that up. But Pastor Washington,
that's what I was talking about, Matthew. Right there, that's what I was talking about.
He's like,
yeah, that was shade. I caught that too. That was shady.
I'm sorry. All right, I'm gonna do less of that, more hosted. So, Pastor Washington, since I kind of cut my teeth on your work when you was talking about Thomas Sowell. Could you tell us a little bit about him and what makes him such the expert and attractive individual to talk about these issues before we dive in?
I cannot tell you what makes him the expert. That would be a lost cause. Can't do that, but because I don't think he is one. But I will tell you this about Thomas Sowell. And I had to lay this groundwork a little before we start to let you know that this is where I stand. This is where I sit before I get into where I stand. We have to admit that Thomas Sowell is an intelligent man. We have to admit that. In fact, I would argue one of the problems with some of his written work on these issues is coming from the pen of such an intelligent person. I want to avoid the mistake, though, of credentialism. And one of the mistakes I think many people make is because he is associated with Ivy League schools, specifically as an educator, and even now he's functioning in his latter years as a fellow because I think he's retired now. The assumption is that he's omnicompetent and he's omniscient. He will sometimes transition out of his fields of study so that he can speak into matters that are beyond his area of expertise. He has a very famous quote. Expertise is, I hope I don't know it. Expertise is non-transferable, and I really wish he would sometimes listen to that quote for himself, because he will sometimes veer from his lane. Now, when I refer to him as brilliant, I'm referring to his prowess as an economist. The problem, though, is economics, numbers in general, exist in a context. So it's possible for you to have a poor grasp of the context in which you are evaluating these numbers, these circumstances, and your conclusion can be valid. Let me be this guy for just a moment. It is possible for a logical syllogism to be valid and still be untrue. And I think that we pursue validity instead of the truthfulness of the conclusion. I could give you the syllogism right now. All people named Brandon are the most brilliant people in the room that they're in. That's premise number one. Premise number two is my name is Brandon, and the conclusion is therefore I'm the most brilliant person in any room I'm in. But you know it's not true. But that's logically valid. I think oftentimes he makes the mistake of evaluating things for logical validity. Does the conclusion align with the premises that precede the conclusion? And because he does that well, he thinks that he's in good standing. He's standing on good ground. But oftentimes, the premises that he's using in the syllogism have flaws. And it's because he's not properly honoring the context. So his numeric conclusions can be good, but still be false. They can be valid. I use that word instead. They can be valid and still be false because he's making some sociological errors. He's making more historical errors than I would like to. We don't have time for all the historical errors, and some of the psychological errors that are just dismissed altogether. They're written off altogether. He ends up getting the platform he has because he's associated with Ivy League schools and he's Black. And he's saying the thing that people who are not Black cannot say. And he's saying it authoritatively. So when you mentioned Matthew that you're going to have this particular discussion around this book, a book I'd read a long time ago and decided to pick up again and endure. It's a pretty quick read. It's a shorter book because it's more footnotes than the book would lead you to believe. Then I wanted to participate in this conversation so we can address some of the content, because he's the consistent regarding the people in my life, the fundamentalists who are cloaked as evangelicals in my life. He's the go-to guy when they're talking to me, and they go to him because he's Black, and he's saying the things that as the idea, he's giving the notions that they already espouse, and because of that, I want to discuss some of those in this setting. I didn't answer your question, MJ, but.
Hey, but let me just say real quick, like, hey, Brandon is already, we 5 seconds in, Brandon is talking that talk. I hope the people really caught what you were saying, which is why Urban Apologetics, Volume 1, Chapter 12, you know what I'm saying, you were tasked with breaking down logic and epistemology and so forth. But hey, man, we can just cut the whole show right there. Like that, you just summarized the book and his whole approach in a nutshell, man. So now I'm inclined to believe that your syllogism might be correct, brother. You might be the most brilliant brother in every room, man. I don't know.
Yeah, the problem is my wife can properly question premise number one, that Brandon is the smartest person in the room. That she knows that one's false, so the conclusion just thrown out the window right away.
No, that's bars though, man. That's bars.
Yes, let's get this done.
Yes, sir.
I came here for Chris. I want to. Yes, MJ claims he's gonna be quiet, but I came here to see because Chris is the one who pursues the smoke. I'm here to I brought a fire hose to keep us tame.
You're just fanning the smoke.
Yes, I'm trying to help us out here, but I want to come for what Chris had to say.
And in the immortal words of the great American poet Kanye West, guess who's going to jail tonight?
Oh Lord,
God's gonna pay my bill tonight.
Mm.
Okay.
All right, so we're gonna keep it moving. And I might have to plug in my my internet. The devil is a liar tonight. So we'll keep this going. So I'm gonna go ahead and add the video. And we are going to start at the 3-minute 11-second mark, and we're just gonna listen to what they got to say real quick, and then
Hey, I got a real quick opening comment. It's like super quick. When
go ahead, Chris.
yeah, okay, like it was weird for me. Like the introduction of the book is a quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which like is like a polarizing, take from his. Like it's like the complete opposite take of his in that the Moynihan report. And so I just felt like some kind of way that he would use that one quote as an introduction. All right, that's it. That's my opening comment.
Adam, you have any comments real to say before we dive right in?
Well, yeah, I really don't have much to add by way of entry. I'm going to post a couple quotes from the book here in a few as we go. But I just want to say yay and amen to everything that Brandon said, and I do want to add too. Actually, if I could at this point, just as a I don't know, just kind of a little pro tip, so to speak. I don't even want to put it that way. Just a tip, I should say. With any material that you're reading, you know what I'm saying? You really want to look at how someone frames their argument.
Yeah.
You have to pay attention to that, because sometimes people can exercise what you might call like a planted axiom, where at the front end of an argument, they already kind of sow the seeds for their conclusion, just in the way that they frame a question or the way that they, frame the path of inquiry at the outset. And so I think we'll see that here going forward. And actually, I do want to say this too, and this actually speaks to something that you said, Brandon. Many people in my circle, they love some Thomas Sowell. I mean, for whatever I suspect, I could be wrong. I think they probably quote Thomas Sowell more when they're talking to me when they do some of their other compadres. You know what I'm saying? Given that he is Black, I suspect that to be the case. Candace Owens is in that same camp. But that being said, my chief concern, I should say, is that what we really need is people who are thoroughly committed to the biblical worldview, parsing out these kinds of issues. And from a Christian standpoint, that's my chief concern. Like, and it's not to say that there isn't, common grace where people who are not of the biblical worldview can't come to right conclusions about things. But I do think that in any genre of study, we ought to always be careful, to keep the biblical lens in focus when we're engaging materials, particularly from folks who do not hold to the biblical worldview. You know what I'm saying? Because there could be times where, like Brandon said, you might have a brilliant individual who is nevertheless encumbered by, the noetic effects of sin. And therefore, we have to strain everything through that biblical lens, lest we be taken aside by their missteps, in reasoning. So I just want to lay that out there, because I think that's going to emerge as well. Not properly taking into account biblical truths that really all of, myself, everybody on this panel, and all my friends who love Thomas Sowell ought to be holding to first and foremost. The biblical worldview and its and all its entailments should be epistemically prior to findings in any particular genre of study, whether it be economics, economics, history, so on and so forth. So,
and here's the problem, because you're trying to get into this video, but so everybody has their preliminary statement. Everyone's laying out their prolegomena right now. Okay, but let me say, I need to amen what Adam just did. And here's an overlooked point. We start with our political tribe, and you find the scholar who backs your tribe. And even believers are doing that. And the problem is, much of what Sowell's economics, or his economic theory is built upon, it's not a biblical worldview. So some of the assumptions biblically, a communal society is an assumption, not even always argued for. It's a presupposition of the biblical text. Loving your neighbor as yourself, sacrificially doing so. That is not a default. That is not a default of his economic theory. And so often the way he reads the circumstances is shaped by the worldview from which he's coming, and that will put him at odds. And despite that, believers will cite him as the authoritative source on these issues. I deliberately stayed away from the video to read the book. I want to respond to the video with some measure of freshness. But I anticipate that that's what we're about to experience.
All right. I gotta say one more thing. Right? I promise we gonna get. But there's just so much meat to that. So to your point, and I would just invite all of particularly my apologetics inclined friends, right, just to kind of contextualize it in that regard. Use the same lens that you would if you were reading Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a brilliant biologist, and he can explicate the theory of evolution or whatever. I'm saying far better than I ever could, right? But I've got good reason to think that he's wrong if he believes that evolution X's out God as a creator, right? So there are so many people that we appeal to all the time, right? When it comes to, shout out to people like Luke Barnes and all the folks like that who understand how you can harness observations from various different fields of study, while at the same time being careful not to go off the cliff of the naturalistic assumptions that undergird some of those people's worldview and methodology. So yeah, all right.
And I'll try to keep it short. But yeah, amen to everything that y'all just said. And both of y'all kind of triggered a couple of thoughts that I thought might be helpful. One is to that last point that Pastor Washington made. Thomas Sowell in 2000 wrote a paper, The Quest for Cosmic Justice. The gist of this paper is that if we attempt to pursue cosmic justice, we'll actually create injustice. So think about that. Go read the paper, and you can kind of catch the gist of that on your own. And which, oddly enough, McDowell makes a comment regarding cosmic justice in the video. We're not going to be talking about that today, I don't think. Secondly is, and more importantly, along with both of you guys kind of alluded to it, Christians and political theory, how Christians seem, from my perspective, to struggle with how to contextualize and how to integrate political this privilege of participation that you have in our modern political construct here in America with the historical biblical, because like nowhere in the Bible times was there a democracy, or was there type of participation that everybody gets in America. There were some people in the Roman Empire. That's the closest thing you get to it. America's kind of modeled off of that, representative republic. But here in America, everybody, the lowest, the slave, the lowest person on the totem pole to the top, everyone has the privilege to participate. But the disconnect is many Christians assume certain parallels between the biblical world and our modern world, and then they assume values, and then they attempt to synthesize and create a framework that their assumption is this is representing biblical values, when nothing could be further from the truth. And this is part of what Pastor Washington was talking about. He's talking about this communal world where a lot of the assumptions, built-in assumptions, were on the premise of communal life supersedes individualistic life. Individualistic life is seen as somewhat selfish. So yeah, with that said, I think, nonetheless, the Bible is sort of a sociopolitical critique in the fact that it's constantly critiquing the kingdom of God, whether it's Yahweh and his kingdom in the Old Testament, Israel, with, Babylon and Egypt and all these other kingdoms, or whether it's Jesus Christ and what he's doing as a polemic or as a contrast of what Rome is doing and what Rome is offering as a state. So yeah, I also think that one of the elephants in the room is the different theological approaches that we have. It feels sort of abstract and disconnected when I hear them talk about politics. Whereas I know that Brandon, I know that Matthew, and I'm not fully sure about you, Adam, but I would assume like all of us has read the King Jesus Gospel. I know I've been heavily influenced by it, and it's along with a lot of the scholars who sort of like continue to grow this concept of the King Jesus gospel, and you get more into the politics as you kind of get into that. So that's really, to me, one of the big elephants in the room. Their theological paradigm doesn't adequately represent politics, and thus they get into the abstract too much. I think our theological paradigm lends very well because it's inherently a political. Jesus is king. It's inherently a political paradigm, and therefore some of these things are a lot easier for us to kind of figure out and synthesize, as well as, you know, understanding biblical values a little bit better. I also feel like when I hear them talk, I hear this disconnect between what the Bible actually espouses on a value level, and I hear them sounding like American conservative values, not actually biblical values. Biblical values seem maybe even repugnant at times to them. Sorry. Hopefully that makes sense.
As you better go.
All right, let's
yeah, you better
let's go ahead and get this show on the road. All right, let me make sure I got the right timestamp. Okay,
Sean, how does he define social justice? Because this is one area where the definition counts for everything.
So I'm just going to read it directly from him. I'm going to open his book and read a lot from Sowell to let him speak for himself. And he writes this. He says, at the heart of the social justice vision is the assumption that because economic and other disparities among human beings greatly exceed any differences in their innate capabilities or capacities, these disparities are evidence or proof of the effects of such human vices as exploitation and discrimination. So at the heart of social justice, to just rephrase this, is that there are certain disparities, economic, output, behaviorally, and they go beyond inner capacities of, say, different groups or different races. That disparity is proof that there's some evil embedded within the system that needs to be surfaced and brought. Now, before we go any further, if that social justice vision is right, then we need to view all disparities as evidence of some kind of discrimination. But what Sowell argues is, yeah, we see certain kinds of differences across racial groups, across other kinds of groups, but that's not evidence of any kind of embedded evil. That's where he pushes back. Now, one other quote by him might help on page 11. He says this: the seemingly invincible fallacy at the heart of the social justice vision is that large categories of people, classes, races, nations, would tend to be either equal or at least comparable in their outcomes in various endeavors if it were not for some discriminatory bias that has intervened to produce the large disparities we see around us. So the bottom line is, when we see disparities, evidence of discrimination. So we have to create policies to change that. And thus, if we made everything else equal, we'd have the same kind of outcomes.
Yeah, and he will cite lots of economic data to suggest that the outcomes are dependent on a whole host of factors as opposed to simply discrimination. Now, he admits that discrimination does play a part in some inequalities and some disparities,
of course,
which I think is undeniable. And historically, it was assumed that there was a difference in genetic capacities, that there were certain races that were inferior genetically to others, and that was fundamentally what explained the disparities. And now, I think what you've read, just I think has pointed out, is that the burden of proof has shifted from being genetically inferior, which nobody accepts any longer, to being sort of baked into the system. And the debate is over whether that's the only thing that's baked into the system that accounts for these inequalities and differences.
all right. Well, you heard the man. So on the one view, if people caught that, on the one view, Sowell is saying that there are those who look and see disparities and see disparities as ipso facto evidence of evil, of a broken system, of systemic brokenness, of systemic. Some people say systemic racism. And Sean McDowell, Dr. McDowell, just also read what Sowell says, is that these disparities could be for any number of reasons, and they are not evil. But I don't see I don't see a lot of nuance between the two extremes, because there could indeed be disparities between differences in people, but there could also be disparities. If you know American history, I mean, you cannot with a straight face say that there are no disparities that have their origins in state policy, private institutions, other outside factors acting on people. I mean, we just got to be honest about this. But I just want to hear what you guys think about what was said there about what Dr. Thomas Sowell is saying. And we'll go ahead and let Pastor Brandon kick it off again.
I reject the premise. I reject the definition on its face. So he's arguing that this is what happens when. This is why we have to be careful, and this goes to something that I believe Adam said earlier. That's why we have to be careful to define our own terms and deploy our own meanings. Okay, so he's giving a definition of social justice, but his biased assessment of social justice is present in his definition. So I'm going to summarize what he said here, so I can respond to it as a whole. He's saying essentially that all we're doing is observing disparities, and the disparities are, from our perspective, evidence of deliberateness, oppression, and injustice. Okay, but that's not all we're doing. There should be some merit to the consistency of disparity, but if I get into that too much, then I'll be accused of being a critical race theorist. So I'm not going to do that right now. But there should be some attention given to consistency. But it's more than just noticing the existence of disparities. It's noticing, it's jumping past them to the deliberateness of them. So I don't have to say I feel like there is an ethnic caste system in America. I don't have to say I feel that. I can cite legal decisions. I can cite policies. I can cite the mandates that came down from the Supreme Court. I can cite the fact that in my city, the neighborhood where I pastored for 10 years was a Black neighborhood, and no one who was outside of that neighborhood knew why. But it was because of very deliberate redlining. And now that our church has moved to a different location, within 2 miles of the building we're in right now, there's a community called the Polo Club. And they had a homeowners association that included the phrase, Blacks and Mexicans need not apply. And it was in their HOA covenant until 2009. And the only reason they caught it was because a white man who was married to a Mexican woman bought the house and he never saw his wife. They assumed his wife was white, and she reviewed the covenant after they bought the house. That was in place until 2009, not 1959, 2009. And even then it was removed only because they threatened legal action after they bought the house. Those circumstances are not my feelings. Those are deliberate and tangible. Those are objective realities that created the disparities that we're referring to. The single greatest means of transferring wealth for every human who is outside of the 1% is their house. It's their home. So if you deliberately deny people access to a home purchase, or you deliberately diminish their home purchase by confining them to the lower income housing of a metropolitan city, you have undermined how much wealth is going to be passed from that generation to the next. That is not how I feel. That is an objective reality. It's the kind of thing that an economist of his sort, of his caliber, should be all over. He should have caught that right away. I'm not merely pointing out that these discrepancies, these disparities exist, the inequities exist. I'm saying that there are direct and measurable causes of the inequities. That's the first thing. The second thing. The second I want to point out is we are forcing ourselves. We're in a situation we've been forced to respond to his straw man, which is an offense to me. He improperly defined the perspective and then handed this over to people who want him to be right because they already hold his idea before even reading the book. And now we are in a place where we have to respond to this flawed explanation of what's going on in the cities where we are leading. And his voice has greater weight because of how much melanin he has. Because he cannot see what I'm observing, then it must not be there. We're in a place where we have to call him brilliant. And I'm gonna say something that somewhat violates the thing that we discussed prior to going live that I was hoping we would not do. But I'm not just calling out his scholarship. I'm calling out his integrity. I'm deeply troubled by his intellectual integrity. This is much more objective reality than his definition allows. The definition will allow the reader to believe. he thinks that we're functioning according to our feelings. And I'm saying that not only is there a disparity, is there inequity, I'm saying that there were deliberate actions that gave rise to it. And I don't have to go back to a couple centuries of slavery. Everyone stops at 1865. No, for the next 100 years, there were deliberate actions, black codes, and the whole notion of separate but equal, and the idea of diminishing of financial prospering, and even persecution and destruction, destroying cities in Tulsa and in Oregon and in Texas and in Oklahoma because they were doing well. You once you destroy a city that's doing well, you have not destroyed just the people who were in that city. You've devastated generations, and you've undermined the transfer of generational wealth. He is accidentally, by conceding the existence of these disparities, he's accidentally dancing over into the lane of intersectionality. While he would take a stand against it, he's actually accidentally making an argument for it, because he's arguing that we should not spotlight one of the disparities. We should not point out one of the inequities. He's saying it should not be weighed more heavily because there are so many others. Well, it could be that these others exist. I want to be very careful here to say this. I'm talking too much, but I need you to hear me say that one of the problems I have with what he did here is he's basically saying that because so many inequities exist, then we should weigh each of them with lesser weight. And I'm saying that the existence of a group of inequities does not diminish the right of each of them to be weighed according to the specifics that gave rise to them. He's making a horrible error. This is a moment of intellectual dishonesty, because he started with his political idea. I'm using his word from chapter 1. He started with his political idea, and from there he came up with his economic idea. And he's arguing for it using rhetoric that sounds ivory tower. And because people are not seeing the flaw from the beginning, they walk away thinking it must be true because Thomas Sowell said it. And the mistake starts with how he defines social justice. Our desire for things to be equal because of a feeling of the circumstances is a gross misrepresentation of his opposing view, and he shot the opposing view down by redefining it inappropriately and setting up a straw man. This is a red herring. He's changing the subject, and we're forced to respond to a changed subject, and we can't let him get away with that.
Let me also just say that Thomas Sowell didn't just start, pushing out this information. He's been pushing these same premises and talking points since the 60s. So this didn't start yesterday. When Dr. Martin Luther King was marching and writing some of his books, I wish people would read them, like Why We Can't Wait, Where Do We Go From Here, things like that. And even when Malcolm X was alive, Dr. Thomas Sowell was around and talking with Milton Friedman and all of the Chicago School of Economics. So this is not something that he just started doing. But Adam, we'll go to you next, man.
Oh man, well, first of all, I'm hesitant to do this because I don't want us to be, written off at the outset. But since you already jumped off that bridge, Brandon, I'm gonna join you, and just say that one of my concerns, with Thomas Sowell's work is I do detect some level of intellectual dishonesty. I was just having this conversation with my wife as I was talking about, getting ready for the show today. I was like, I hate to even say it because, I wouldn't want people to be like, oh, well, it's just ad hominem attacks. But no, like on the basis of having read his work and taking into account his level of acumen in his field, his level of intellect, it seems to me that a plausible explanation for some of these fundamentally just egregious errors, intellectual dishonesty seems to be a plausible explanation. Maybe perhaps there's something else. But I just want to share that stage or jump off that bridge with you. Now, real quick, I just want to also talk about. Let me just read this definition again. I've got it right here. So, at the heart of the social justice vision is the assumption that. And this is actually that just goes to Brandon's point. I'm not going to repeat it, but I find it interesting that you bake into as you're defining something, you bake into the notion that it's an assumption before you've even debunked it in your work. But at least in this book, anyway, at the heart of the social justice vision is the assumption that because economic and other disparities among human beings greatly exceed any differences in their innate capacities, these disparities are evidence or proof of the effects of such human vices as exploitation and discrimination. So here's the thing. There's a couple things going on here. I want to talk about that word evidence, for a second, right? This gets into epistemology. One of the concerns I have, with the way that he used the word evidence, and even to some degree how I think it was kind of leveraged, if you will, in the portion of the video that we just saw, is that we have to remember that evidence is not something that's necessarily evidence. That doesn't necessarily commend certainty, right, to somebody who has it, right? You can have evidence for something, even if that evidence doesn't give you certainty, right? That's the way the evidence works, right? That's why if you go to a court of law, you talk about the standard being the preponderance of evidence, particularly in civil cases, right? There's levels of evidence. You can have a little bit of evidence. You can have a lot of evidence, right? But that doesn't necessarily demean any given piece of evidence just because it may or may not in and of itself be such that you could just base a conclusion on, solely. So my concern is that when they talk about evidence, right, that disparities are they believe to be in some sense wrongly taken to be evidence. This goes back to something you were saying earlier, Brandon, that you can have a valid argument, but if your context isn't right, if you're not taking into account context, then you can come to these valid conclusions that aren't sound. You can have a valid argument, but not be a sound argument. I think that's something that's going on here, because the reality is, yes, if you're in a context where, I'm thinking about like the Tulsa massacre. I'm thinking about right out here in Charlottesville, Virginia, where you had an area called Vinegar Hill. It was a very similar situation. Fortunately, it didn't end in bloodshed, but you have, with a stroke of a pen, policies were changed in the 50s and 60s, such that they disenfranchised an entire group of people and pretty much wiped out their Black Wall Street out here in Charlottesville. When you have, I was in Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, right before COVID hit, and shout out to my guy Quentin. He was sharing with me how in Nebraska back in like the 30s and 40s, I think it was, you had labor unions that banded together to keep Blacks out, from some of the meat packing plants and things like that, and how that impacted. So there's all these instances around the country of there being actual occurrences of racially motivated, whether it be policies or actions taken against Black people specifically. It would be utterly mysterious to me that somehow all of these instances had no impact whatsoever in terms of creating a disparity. To me, I think that's the most, astounding thing about Thomas Sowell's work. That somehow all of this racism that they grant, and mentioned in the video and also in the book, he grants that it did exist. Somehow, mysteriously, this racism is just inert in America. It's impotent to bring about effects. It just exists, and yet, nevertheless, there's no reason to think that it's doing anything. That's silly. I think any rational person, when you come across a disparity between African Americans and white folks, here in America, given the context that we live in historically, that there are actual accounts of ill being committed against Black people, it's not irrational to take a disparity to be reason giving. That's what evidence is. Evidence is something that's reason giving in favor of a conclusion. Yes, a disparity can be a piece of evidence if you take into account the historical context. Now, if we're just going to throw history out the window, then sure. I mean, you can say whatever you want. We can be like Thomas Sowell and take an ahistorical approach to the effects of racism. We could do that, or we could just say, you know what, maybe it's not definitive. Like maybe the existence of a disparity isn't necessarily an indication of racial bias and discrimination. That's fair. But the idea of being flippant about it being taken as a piece of evidence, at the outset and kind of baking that into your definition, I think that's just, that's foolhardy and irresponsible.
Adam, let me say this because RoboCop's going to take over in a second here. He's accusing us of starting with the disparity and then reverse engineering racism or injustice. Okay?
Exactly.
That is not what I'm doing. That is not what any of us is doing. That's not what hardly any person he's writing this book for is doing. It is possible to see the disparities and then ask yourself, is there a historical link, a series of events that culminated in that moment, and then trace it back? No, you're not inventing a cause. You're recognizing that history culminated in the moment where this disparity is on display.
Right.
It's almost an offense. It's a mockery of intelligent people to say, you see the disparities, and he's willing to concede them, but because you use the word that was burning a hole in my head, Adam. He's ahistorical. The present moment is the last chapter in a series of events. It didn't come out of nowhere. So the segregation of the 20th century was a chapter at the end of a series of events. The present, and he concedes this in his book. I noticed that he only went back to 1947 when he referred to black-white economic disparity. I said, bro, this goes back generations, centuries before 1947. How did you choose that? It was alive in 1947. The 1947 is a product of a series of events that preceded. And he's saying all we're doing is looking at the moment and assuming something preceded it. I don't have to do that. That the people who created the circumstances did so shamelessly. They were open. The Dred Scott decision is public record.
Right.
I don't have to invent anything that would cause the disparity. The overthrow of Reconstruction, the behavior of Andrew Johnson after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, that's public record. The re-empowerment of Confederate soldiers and politicians, that's public record. I don't have to invent anything. I can make the connection between the broken circumstances and the circumstances that broke them. It's an offense. I don't even see how someone this intelligent can do it accidentally.
But see, here's the thing, though, Brad. I don't mean to cut you off, but here's how we know that Thomas Sowell and people those who agree with him, we know that they're able to make those connections because they do it all the time when it comes to the black family. When Thomas Sowell talks about how you are more likely to be successful economically, so on and so forth, and you're in a better situation economically, right? If you are married, and people who are not married and out here, particularly if you're having kids, then you're probably not going to be doing too well economically. They recognize that to be a phenomenon, and they have no problem tracing that back to welfare policies that kept black men out the home and so on and so forth. So they have no problem with looking at an effect and tracing the cause back to a policy. Again, it's just mysterious to me that somehow it's only a one-way street. When it's something you can pin on progressives, then all of a sudden we have all these resources to figure this out. But nevertheless, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, brother. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just making that point. Like when it comes to something that can be traced back to progressives, then all of a sudden we have this wide open lens, But if we want to talk about these other instances that fall at the feet of America in total, right?
If I were to sit down,
these conservatives we had to take ownership of, then all of a sudden we don't know. Well, you can't, we can't take that into account. It's spurious. I mean, we just out of left field.
My favorite example of that,
intellectual dishonesty that I fear might be present.
It cannot be accidental. My favorite example of him doing that is if you want to get Thomas Sowell on a soapbox, then bring up the New Deal, and he will directly link the New Deal to much of the economic breakdown we're experiencing right now. He recognized that is a chapter that precedes subsequent chapters. In fact, consequent chapters gave rise to the chapters that came after them. Why is that not true of slavery and the overthrow of Jim Crow and Dred Scott and redlining and Tulsa? Why did those large scale, national, often federally backed incidences give rise to moments that come after them? It's ahistoricism, but it's a selective ahistoricism. He looks at history and he sees the things that align with his economic and political worldview, and the things that would undermine it are irrelevant. He will even concede their existence, but he will argue that they're irrelevant. And that creates complexities when you're dealing with discussions of social justice and ethics in general, social ethics. He's not approaching this well. He's approaching this from the perspective of someone who weighs numbers, but not as a historian. And if you're going to be, you have to first be a good historian before you can be good at anything.
Mm-hmm.
Amen. Amen. Oh, goodness gracious. I almost don't want to say much because I want to constrain some time. So I'm going to try to speak real fast. First thing that came to mind when I listened to that clip was, oddly enough, Greg Koukl and his tactics in defending your faith. He said, an alternate explanation is not a refutation. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that the book's introduction was a quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan's report on the Black family from, what was that, like 63, 64, somewhere in the neck of the woods. And so anyway, my assumption is that he's read it. Oddly enough, Moynihan comes to a completely different conclusion than he. The one thing that we probably agree on is the impact on the Black family and its impact on a lot of these issues. But also, Moynihan points out that the oppression that Black people were experienced contributed as much, if not more, to the disparities in plight of the African American at the time in the 1960s, right? So that's one thing. An alternate refutation is not an alternate explanation is not a refutation. And Thomas Sowell doesn't seem to attempt to refute this alternate paradigm. He seems to just offer an alternative as a solution as to the existence of the disparity. So that's one, which I think is problematic. One of the reasons that's problematic is because there's, as Pastor Washington eloquently pointed out, it's never been equality. I mean, why don't you go, instead of going back to the 40s, why don't you go back to 1619? Run them numbers again. Tell me how things play out there. The reality is there's always been disparities when it comes to African Americans in America. It's just always. It's due to the nature of how many of us got here, and then how people who look like us, people of color, were treated subsequently after it was outlawed to own us and we freed. We still didn't have equal opportunity to forge a economic existence for ourselves. We were locked out of this education system. We were locked out of medical. We were locked out of virtually everything. So it would make sense if it makes more sense to me if we're considering the continuity between the history of African Americans and people of color in this country and the present disparities that exist, that there's a correlation between the two, which is one of my main points. Okay, so there's a logical there's a principle in logic, Occam's razor, right? So whatever is the most likely is probably the reason, and you should pause right there and exhaustively explore that before you move on to other options. In other words, the amount of energy that you're going to spend if you add a bunch of other potential factors onto the table, it's going to take you longer and you won't be as effective. So stop right there. And so when you consider logic, philosophy, what's a priori? What's the first most intuitive thing that all of us would probably think of? We would all say it's probably racism, the history of racism in this country. And so that's what we should do. So I think that on the most basic philosophical exploration of the origin of the disparities, it makes sense, logical sense, that you would assume racism and explore that before you move on. So when Thomas Sowell comes to the table, offers an alternate explanation based on this eclectic group of factors, which are reasonable in and of themselves, but on the surface level, they don't make sense when you consider the history. The further back in time, they become less and less relevant. That's why he stops at 1941, because the further back in time you go, the less relevant and realistic that they are a viable alternative to the reason for the disparities that exist. Last point that I'm going to make is this. I forget the host. He made a comment. He said something to the effect of, this debate is over what's baked into the system, right? He said that's really the question. What's baked into the system? Is it the disparities that Thomas Sowell, or is it racism that's baked into the system that's contributing to, or the real reason for the outcome of the disparities? And I would say this. You can look at that from an active perspective. So you could say, hey, there's some pointy white hooded folks covertly in the system. I don't believe that. I doubt any of these guys believe that. There might be some crazy person out there that's like that. I'm a little I'm leery of that. I don't think there is. I think more so likely is, as some of what Pastor Washington was pointing out, is broken systems that were established to be broken were never fixed. And like in 2009, when they found this covenant within this HOA they're just there. And you don't know. No one's combing history and saying, let's find all of the obscure laws that were put in place that were designed to disenfranchise people of color. You just discover them when you discover them. And the reality is they've been there impacting things all along, which influences the outcome. In addition to that, what's even harder to quantify is people who live with the disparities, like social environments have an impact on people's behaviors. It's a reality. Social environments have an impact. So if you come from a social environment that doesn't have high education, if you come from a social environment that doesn't have the social skills to go in and negotiate a salary, to go in and to buy a home and to understand all these legal documents that you're signing, PMI, and all of the value of the home versus the value of the loan. And, if you don't understand these things, you're likely to be a victim of the system. And last comment I'll make is I myself was a victim of the system. My first house that I bought, I bought a house, and but at the time, we had good credit and we were able to afford it. But I had never bought a house before, had no sense of what buying a house was. Maybe 4 years later, the people who wrote the loan, it was called Loan Giant, Title Giant, everything was giant. You can look this up on the internet. All of these organizations were raided by the feds and shut down because they were fudging stuff. Like in my case, they said my house had an additional bedroom that it actually didn't have, which allowed them to increase the value, which allowed them to give me a loan value higher than the house was actually worth.
Wow.
And because we could afford to pay for it, we never knew. We found out when the feds shut them down. And when the Fed shut them down and eventually took our loan and gave it into another entity to finance. So that's when we found out that we were victims, and they shut down. It was a whole scheme with the people who were writing the loans, who were appraising the houses, who were giving the insurance, all the way to who was processing the loans and holding them for a few years before they sell them. Taylor, Bean, and Whitaker. It was a whole bunch of organizations that were shut down. So in my case, I might have been able to, if I was more literate, if my parents were literate and their parents were literate, if I had multiple generations of learning lessons in literacy and in developing social etiquette and skills and knowledge, that might have been something that I may have been able to avoid. That's something that you cannot even quantify when we're talking about these disparities. How many people are not making equal pay because they don't know how to negotiate a salary? How many people are not making who do not get equal benefits, equal paid time off, and all these other elements of having employment because we just don't have the social skills? So I think that this conversation, when we're talking about these disparities, it's a lot deeper and a lot more complex than we would like to give, which is one of the frustrations for me when Sowell and then Biola in doing this interview, reading this book and advancing this book as helpful, to me it's like their oversimplification of these things is contributing to the problem itself. And what they need to do is take a step back and listen to critical voices. It's not going to hurt to listen to a critical voice. So that's all. There you go.
That's going to be he just used the word. I think it's going to be a theme for the entire evening. It was a theme for the book: oversimplification.
Yes.
When you want to make an argument that's a misrepresentation, you have to oversimplify the circumstances. You have to be dismissive of the nuance. And I think that's what he does well. He actually does that well. He oversimplifies the subject matter.
Matter of fact, can I pull a slide up to that point? I actually have a slide.
Yeah, go ahead and share it.
Can I share that? Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think I have an example here, at least kind of in the ballpark. Give me 1 second.
I'm surrounded by tech-savvy people. So Apologist in the Court has a digital version of the book, and Adam is pulling up slides. I would know how to do it.
Can y'all see that?
I see it.
Okay, so this is a quote, from the book that we're reviewing here, right? I think it's in the section. I'll get the page number later, but this is from I think it's in Racial Fallacies. I think it's in that chapter. He says, so since the most often discussed disparities in the United States have been disparities between Black and white Americans, this is a good place to begin as any. The question is whether differences between Black and white Americans are unusual or are of an unusually larger magnitude than differences amongst other groups in the United States or elsewhere. I'm just going to pause there for a second. I'm going to read that this one section again. The question is whether differences between Black and white Americans are unusual. Now, when I came to that, let me just take this off for a second. When I came to that, I wrote in my margins, why? Why is that the question? Right? It's not about, the question is not whether or not the disparities are unusual, right? Because what he does is, and I'll show this in a second, he goes on to point out disparities between like Asians and Black people and Mexicans and so forth. And so he's like, well, there's disparities in these other groups. And so it's not unusual that there's a disparities between Black and white people. But again, this is that point where you're just kind of ignoring certain nuances, right? It's not the issue of whether or not disparities are unusual. The question is, have injustices occurred or not? That's the question, right? Do we have evidence? Do we have reason to believe that the disparities are undergirded or brought about, I should say, by some sort of volitional bias, race, i.e. racism? That's the question, right? Because, you know, as a matter of fact, let me share it again. My bad. And forgive me for the long quote here. But notice how he just frames like, well, is it unusual or not? I mean, you know what? I'm inclined to think that the discrimination and biases is not unusual. As a matter of fact, I think given my worldview as a Christian, being a believer, knowing that man is depraved, it's very usual that we should find people being biased and discriminating towards each other. That's really actually, it's not unusual. So for me, the key point is not going to be whether it's unusual or not, right? The question is we want to look for explanation. So he says the question is also whether there are any other discernible reasons. The question, sorry, I forgot that twice. Any other discernible reasons for those differences besides race, that is genetics or racism? Median Black American family income has been lower than median white American family income for generations as regards to the magnitude of the difference. Official government data going back to as far as 1947, there's that magic year again, that before which there was no disparity, apparently, show that the disparity has not been as large as 2 to 1 in any of those years. How does that particular disparity compare to disparities among other groups in the United States or among other groups in other countries within the United States? The median per capita income of such Asian ethnic groups as those of the Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and Korean ancestry is more than twice as high as the median per capita income of Mexican Americans. These Asian groups also have higher median per capita incomes than the median per capita income of white Americans. Asian Indians have nearly 3 times the median per capita income as Mexican Americans, and the median per capita income more than $15,000 a year higher than the median per capita income of white Americans. Among full-time year-round male workers, Asian Indians males earned over $39,000 a year more than white full-time workers year-round. Is the white supremacy we are so often warned about in some quarters? I cut off the quote, but is white supremacy to explain all of that data, right? Now, here's what I think is fascinating. With respect to the relationship, if we will, between the Black community and the white community, do we have historical data that tells us that some real injustices have occurred? Absolutely. Could the same thing be said between Asians and Mexicans? I don't know. I maybe, but on the face of it, I'm not aware of any historical dynamic between Koreans and Indians and so forth and Mexicans that is in any way like the dynamic between Black Americans and white Americans. So again, if you want to play the numbers game as an economist, I understand. But then we see glaringly this critique that Brandon Washington brought up earlier, where we can play the numbers game and not capture real history, and thus not really have an understanding of real causes, right? It's apples and oranges. You know what I mean? And so actually, let me camp out there, because I feel like we spent like an hour on the first.
We did. But that was so bad. It was so bad. But look what you did, because let me see why I love what you just did, Adam. You challenged the question the question he's asking.
That's what I was trying to get to.
When I was in seminary, I had a professor tell me, he said, good theologians, which I would not accuse Thomas Sowell of being. The good theologians don't fixate on answering questions only. They fixate on asking the right questions, asking good questions. And I think that what we're noticing here is he's answering questions well. but they're not questions relevant to the subject matter. They're not the questions that actually probe the subject matter. I think even readers who agree with him will notice he had a very good response to that question, but they'll miss the fact that he was the one who framed the question.
Thank you.
He framed the question very specifically that sets up the answer he's going to bring. And I think that if he were to ask some harder questions of history, the question you asked about is there a rift between Asian and Latino communities? And I would agree with you. It's not as extreme as black and white. The next question is, why is the rift between black and white so extreme? Is there any event in history or series of events in history, centuries-long events in our history that gave rise to that moment? He's not asking the right question, and because he's asking the wrong question that he can navigate well, he's answering a bad question well, and that's impressive to the reader who doesn't know the subject matter well.
Right. Well, actually, can I just be real quick and share like one more slide, MJ? Can I do that?
Yeah.
To your last point about that rift and the history of it. So again, if you're just looking at the numbers, then it's like, okay, well, it's not unusual that there would be disparities between black and white, right? Because you got these disparities elsewhere over here. But if we're looking for explanations, we want to see what's the most plausible explanation for why a disparity exists, right? Then we're going to take into account not just the numbers, we're going to look at historical context, right? And then also, this is where worldview comes in, we're going to take into account the depravity of man, right? So yes, it's not unusual that there would be disparities of a racist or volitional or whatever sort, some type of discrimination. Actually, I don't think that's unusual, given the fact that that's exactly what I expect from broken man and the systems that broken man creates. We just need to ask better questions to get to the heart of it. But to your last point, though, again, this is where I'll just read the quote. Let me not commentate yet. All right. So he lays out all these disparities, right? But earlier in the book, he said that the point here is that in what might seem like very similar circumstances, there can be very different histories, cultures, and outcomes in particular endeavors. Particularly, groups having particular skills and particular kinds of endeavors have been a common fact of life over the centuries and in countries around the world. Even if two groups happen to live in identical, tangible surroundings today, how likely would they be to have had the same environmental influences throughout all the scores of millennia of human existence? So again, in chapter, I think it's chapter 2, he's talking about, well, it's not unusual, that we have these disparities, and you can just look at the Asians over here and the Mexicans and so forth. Yet earlier in the book, he acknowledges there can be very different histories, cultures, and outcomes in particular endeavors, right? So my question would be, this is my last slide here. He says, quote, in addition to ongoing differences among peoples, there have also been unpredictable episodic events, such as wars, famines, and epidemics that can disrupt the development path of particular peoples. Really? No kidding, right? The outcomes of military conflicts can be a matter that are incalculable and yet able to determine the fate of whole societies or nations for subsequent generations. Let me read that again. He gives this example. The outcomes of military conflicts can be a matter of chances that are incalculable and yet able to determine the fate of whole societies or nations for subsequent generations or centuries. Now, I just want to submit, among these different episodic events, such as wars, famines, and epidemics, could slavery be one of those?
I'm sorry.
Could slavery be an episodic event? Could that be in that category? Could a protracted period of Jim Crow, redlining? I know he doesn't like that example. You know what I'm saying? But I'll just say systemic injustice, like documented, like policies that we can go back and read today. Could those be considered the kinds of episodic events that would determine the fate of a particular people group, i.e. African Americans, for generations to come? So maybe it's the case that it's not just Black people are unmarried and lazy. Maybe there's some other explanation. Maybe there's some episodic events that we can look to and then help us to understand why there's that disparity between Black and white Americans that doesn't necessarily fit and apply to the disparity that we can observe between Asians and Mexicans and so forth? Could there be something like that, Thomas? So I think it seems to me, I'm quoting this, I'm quoting him. I would think he would at least have to entertain that as a real.
I know we could bring slides, Matthew. I would have, but I will use Adams. Adam, you just showed a quote of him recognizing how circumstances beyond our control can have implications on two different people groups and how those two different people groups develop. Okay.
Right.
What does he do with the reality that in American history, one of the two groups deliberately controlled the circumstances? In addition to having wars, famines, and epidemics, you have redlining, you have Jim Crow, you have the overthrow of the 13th Amendment in the immediate aftermath of a president's assassination. Those are deliberate acts that will have ongoing implications for generations to come. He concedes the possibility while overlooking the deliberateness of the occurrences in our history. How is that okay? You can't convince me that someone who's able to notice one is entirely blind to the other. That's why I'm saying that this has to be some degree of this has to come down to some measure of integrity. For him to be able to recognize one so well and miss the other so much, I'm now calling his intellectual integrity into question.
That's what I'm saying.
I think he can.
That's why I was just saying earlier. But it's for examples like these. That's why I have to at least question, the intellectual honesty going on. I'm just saying.
Just to, can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So just to answer your question, like how can he recognize basically these facts? He gets around that by likening the actions of governments and oppressions and things like that to almost like naturalistic occurrences within nature. Mm-hmm. These are just a part of reality, and therefore, since they're a part of reality, and we can look back into other civilizations and see these disparities and how people have been oppressed and enslaved and things like that. It's natural. It's a part of life. It happened back then. It happened, recently. Therefore, we shouldn't do anything to fix it. And so it's kind of like a reverse is-ought fallacy, if you think about it. This has been the case, therefore we ought do nothing about it. So that's how you get with it. And you would expect that from Thomas Sowell in light of his convictions on cosmic justice. Yeah, he's an atheist.
It's exactly. It's the Josh McDowell's. It's the the guys like Josh McDowell, the Christians who he's influencing, and the broader, from my perspective, a Christian apologist community who seem to be advancing Thomas Sowell as a voice that Christians should be consuming. It's those people I think where the problem is, because those people should recognize there is a God. They're Christians. And there is a such thing as cosmic justice, and there is a such thing as justice right here, right now, that our God, Jesus, cares about. And so therein lies the conflict, or therein lies the conflict for me. It's the Christians. It's not the Thomas Sowells. I take exception with Thomas Sowell, but I'm really taking exception with the Christians who are advancing Thomas Sowell and saying that his views are actually consistent with biblical ethics. Nothing can be further from the truth as far as we've been discussing today.
He's a functional. One of your takeaways from reading the essay on cosmic justice is that he's a functional atheist.
Yeah.
As I understand it, he's an atheist. Yeah.
He's a social Darwinist.
He's a self-proclaimed atheist, and he has a long track record of of writing publicly what his views are on anthropological views are. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to from a Christian perspective to factor that in when you're listening to that dude.
Can I co-sign you right quick on that, Chris? Because and use an example from this book. So, for example, I want to say it's the first or second chapter. When he's talking, as Matt said earlier, he's giving different. No, excuse me. I think it was you, Chris, that said he's giving different alternate explanations. That's the word that I'm looking for,
Yeah.
right? And so when he talks about disparities, he uses the before, but they're like geographical disparities.
These people have agricultural prowess. These people have scientific prowess.
Right, because,
and these different orientations lead to them, their behaviors that lead to outcomes. Yeah.
Exactly. Because in one society there were mangoes, and in one society there wasn't. And so you have better mango makers over here than you have over there. Mm-hmm. And so he attributes, some level of disparity amongst humankind, if you will, amongst groups to that. Now, as a Christian, right, what I should say is, first of all, given that we have the brokenness of this world to contend with, we know that's a real thing. The ground is cursed. In some sense or another, things are not going well for mankind as they ought to be, were it not for sin and brokenness, right? So if there is some sort of disparity that just arises from the natural predicament in a world where sin wasn't an issue, then what you would have is some sort of collaboration and cooperation amongst people such that nobody is going without and everybody flourishes. That's what you would have, right? I can imagine that even if sin hadn't happened, if you live in Alaska and you can't farm, then maybe the people over in Tahiti, and this is probably a horrible example, but the people in Tahiti who got resources, they would probably ship some food to you, you know what I mean? So that we can continue to replenish the earth and subdue it and so forth, right? That's what would be happening in the absence of sin. My point is, there's a kingdom ethic, there's a biblical ethic that supersedes what is just simply natural. Even in the face of natural produced disparities, that doesn't mean that there isn't an ought, right? Natural disparities is not a way out. It's not a moral escape hatch from taking action to ensure or at least promote or undergird the human flourishing of another. And so this is why with my Christian brothers and sisters, the Sean McDowells, Josh McDowells of the world, this is why I would commend to you, please let's lay Thomas Sowell. I won't say lay him aside, but let's be careful at how we, promote his work. I wouldn't promote it at all, at least not to a Christian audience. Let's be careful with that, because you're endorsing a guy whose moral presuppositions are not going to yield the type of biblical fruit that you ought to be promoting, right? His moral presuppositions are rooted in naturalism. If he sees disparity, he's like, man, bump it. It is what it is. That's not Bible. We're talking about a God who put gleaning laws in place for a reason, right? We're talking about a God who, in the New Testament, when Macedonia is struggling, Paul's not like, man, it sucks for them. Nah, Philippi, y'all need to send some bread over. Like, y'all need to, do right, and then the vice versa, because they looked out for y'all. Like that's what the biblical ethic, commands, even, right? And so you're not going to get that from Thomas Sowell. So we need to stop taking our cues, I think, from people who don't know Jesus. I would just say it flatly. I'm saying we need to stop taking cues from people, moral cues from people who don't know Christ, don't know the biblical ethic, and can't exegete a passage of scripture to save their life. We need to stop doing that. Yeah, and responsible for that. You know what I'm saying?
I know at least this is me dancing close to the shadiness I was hoping to avoid, but I know at least 2 well-platformed evangelical leaders who have recently published books dedicated to Thomas Sowell, and thank him for the world, for how his writings influenced their worldview and the content of the book. And I have a whole different perspective on this now. One of the first things you should do when you evaluate someone's written work is you should assess their worldview. If it's functionally atheistic, then to the point that Chris is making, should I have expectations of communal values? Should I have expectations of loving your neighbor as yourself? Should I have expectations of sacrificially seeking the well-being, the thriving of others? Should I have those expectations? I'd argue that the answer to those questions would be no. So then why does he get such? I think what we're noticing here is the breakdown of American evangelicalism. We are much more of a political tribe than a theological one. And he's giving the appropriate theological, he's giving the appropriate political rhetoric. I know the author of that book well. He's giving the appropriate political rhetoric to co-sign some of these ideas, and the church is saying, Now, the danger in that is, and this goes to the King Jesus Gospel comment from Chris earlier, that we are political agents because we're part of a kingdom. We're citizens. In fact, we're officers in it. We're ambassadors. In a kingdom, we are political agents. But the American political structure is subject to that one. It's subject to the higher one. And we've adopted the lower kingdom, often at the expense of the values, the virtues, and the identity of the higher one. And so much so that we will platform and co-sign and laud a functional atheist because his worldview probably undergirds the one we want to be true. That is disconcerting, to say the least.
To say the least.
Let me get this.
You get another clip, and you know
how many clips do you have, Matthew? How many clips do you have, man?
You're not getting to them
Man,
all.
I had.
We're gonna be okay. Let's just go ahead. Let's just play the clip. Let's just play the clip. Let's go.
All right. Let's go.
We make a distinction between social justice and other types of biblical justice, for example.
Yeah.
What's the difference?
Well, I don't think a Christian ethic of justice would look at differences and necessarily assume there's some evil built into the system causing it. So you even have, teachings of Jesus like the talents, 5 and 3 and 1. Well, that's a difference. That's not considered bad.
If you knew what a talent was worth, that's a big difference.
That's a huge economic difference,
That's right.
But that's not considered bad. So even within the body of Christ, we have different gifts. We have different callings. You have the ear, you have the eye, you have the foot. Like there are differences within the world, not better or worse. That's the way the world is. Now, classically, justice is giving someone their due. So if the punishment is too great, that's unjust. If the punishment is too less, that's unjust. Really, the principle of justice is built into Exodus 21, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That the punishment ought to fit the crime. And the scriptures are full of God ultimately bringing cosmic justice in the universe, but governments, in particular, Israel, should be built on just principles. And I should treat my neighbor lovingly. In a sense, you ask, what is justice to my neighbor? Well, giving my neighbor my due, which is what? To love my neighbor. So when people ask me my thoughts on social justice, I say, I believe in biblical justice, not social justice, if what we mean by social justice is the way Thomas Sowell defined it.
So,
yeah, I don't believe in social justice in the way that Thomas Sowell defined it either. So,
All right.
we have a point of agreement there,
Well,
right?
We can't.
I mean,
we can't let Thomas Sowell define justice for us. And secondly, to define justice only as in retributive justice, it misses what the Bible teaches about justice. It really does. The Bible has a more expansive notion of justice, where even
robust.
It's very robust and expansive. And so what we can't do is bring our very classical liberal notions of justice that reduce it down to proportionality in terms of punishment, and then call that justice. And then I think Sean did understand that God ultimately is going to bring cosmic justice to the earth. But when I read Romans 6, where it tells us that we have died to sin, that we are no longer to yield our members to sin and things like that. But if you get behind the Greek within that, on the flip side, we are to yield our members as weapons of justice and righteousness and things like that. And we're not punishing people if in that context. We're doing justice. That's something that we're commanded to do. So I just think that it's very troubling to get our definitions of justice from Thomas Sowell to begin with. But I want to hear what you guys have to say. Yeah.
If I can just piggyback on that real quick to your point, giving somebody their due, the way that he described it seemed to be more in line. And I know, Sam, you can speak more on this as well, but that captures mishpat, right? The Jewish word, the Hebrew word mishpat. Now, if we're talking about mishpat, which is rendered as justice, I'm saying in our English versions, then giving someone their due, like in a legal context, i.e., not putting laws on the books that devalue their homes in favor, and so things like that. That's mishpat, right? But then also you have Zedekiah, which is often rendered as justice in the Old Testament. You see it kind of expressed more so in the notion of like charity and righteousness, and you're particularly moving towards the New Testament. That's a biblical iteration of justice as well, right? So to really capture what the Bible is talking about when it talks about justice, you have to take into account mishpat and Zedekiah, right? Now Zedekiah is also this notion of giving somebody what they're due, but it's more so, it's not necessarily in a legal context, it's giving people what they're due in light of them being made in the image of God. What kind of treatment for a person is commensurate for somebody who's made in the image of God, for being made in the image of God? That's really what Zedekiah is trying to capture. And that really has to do with all of your relationships and whatever realm of influence you find yourself in. You should be living out Zedekiah as you interact with everyone. That would include your fellow residents in whatever nation you find yourself in, whatever context.
Even with Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, exactly. We love him too. We, in Jesus' name. Yeah, absolutely. But I think that unfortunately we do a good job of that mishpat. Some of us love mishpat. They want to talk about law and order all day long. You know what I mean? But we have a hard time with that Zedekiah piece for whatever reason. Somehow that Zedekiah doesn't line up with our modern post-Enlightenment ideals, which I find interesting.
A couple things here. I'm actually going to be brief because I do want to get to some other clips. Sean McDowell said that he mentioned that one of the imperatives for him is to love his neighbor. That is not what the Bible says. I want to be that guy for just a moment. The Bible says, love your neighbor as yourself. It gives a very specific standard of expectation that is innately sacrificial. That's the empathetic imperative. So you're supposed to not just see the neighbor and say, I love them in that situation. You have to see the neighbor and put yourself in the situation and then extend to them what you would need under the same circumstances. The whole idea of that's the first point I want to drive home. The whole idea of making a person whole. That's the consistent pushback on this. Whenever there's a discussion regarding something like reparations comes up, that conversation gets bogged down because the argument is I didn't do it. Okay, here's the problem with that. And oftentimes the representative of the person saying it is a representative of the institution, is a representative of the state. That when the discussion regarding reparations was brought before Congress, and they had Ta-Nehisi Coates take the platform. Ta-Nehisi Coates is an atheist, and because of that, he and I are often on opposite sides of a social conversation. I've never heard a better argument for reparations in my life. He had me walking around like, man, yeah, where's my check? I have never heard a better argument than read the case for reparations. His article in goodness, not the New Yorker, what was it? The Atlantic. The Atlantic is one of the best arguments I ever made. He uses Chicago as a case study. Here's a pushback on it though. The argument is I wasn't there, so I wasn't the one who did it. My problem with that is everyone wants to be individualistic when it's convenient, and they want to be communal when it's convenient. So they will claim that we did win World War II. Who won World War II? We did.
What we?
Who was that we? We weren't
That's
there.
right.
We weren't there. But we will commemorate the decisions of presidents. We will honor treaties that precede the moment that we're in. We will say America accomplished this.
Pearl Harbor, 9/11.
I cannot believe
4th of July.
I cannot believe how often I have to bring to someone's attention that they're telling me regarding 9/11, they're telling me never forget, which by the way, I agree with. I affirm that. Amen. I'm also saying you should not forget what happened in 1619. You should not forget 1861 to 65. You should not forget Jim Crow. You should not forget redlining. I'm saying never forget those things. Why do you selectively emphasize what should be remembered? And one of the ways you do that is you are selective when we will be communal. You decide we're going to be corporate here and we're going to be individual here. So they're saying to me, I should blame the slave owner, the one who enslaved. but the enslaver did it with the sanctioning, in fact, with legal backing of the state. Frederick Douglass was called to give a speech on a day that commemorates the liberation, the deliverance, the freedom of America. And on that day, he has to say, what to me is the 4th of July? What to the slave is the 4th of July? And the thing that gets lost in the narrative here is on the day when they invited him to deliver that speech, he was an escapee from slavery because he was a violator of the Fugitive Slave Act.
He was a fugitive.
So he had to escape so that he could be free enough to deliver the speech about your freedom.
Come on, man.
How was that lost? And how's everyone missing that?
Right.
So it was, and he had to deliberately hide because a Maryland enslaver, if ever put eyes on him, could, with the backing of the federal government, could re-enslave him, which means this is not the individual enslaver's crime. That is the institution's crime. So you're trying to blame the individual enslaver when it was an act of the institution. I'm saying if you're going to claim Pearl Harbor and the 4th of July, and you're going to claim 9/11, you have to claim the institutional act of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. That's yours too. You owe the descendants of Frederick Douglass reparations for what was done to him, and the loss that was stolen, that which was stolen from his progeny, as you undermine his potential to accrue generational wealth and experience all the benefits and privileges of freedom. For some reason, that does not weigh on Thomas Sowell's take on justice. He has defined social justice in a way when the fact that Frederick Douglass had to be an escapee so he could deliver a message on freedom, that his view of social justice completely overlooks that is a significant reality. By the way, it was not. I want to be careful here because everyone's going to point out Frederick Douglass as an outlier. No, he was one of thousands.
Oh, for sure. And let me say this too, to your point. Like we do know that the United States government can stand in a court of law as a defendant, right? I mean, like, you know, if there's a vaccine that goes wrong, that somehow, you know, got approved by the federal government, like, you know, the federal government can be sued for that, right? Like, so it's not out of this, you know, out of left field that the federal government can be held liable for what it has done as an institution. Last thing I'm gonna say on this too is,
I'm sorry. Please, let me do this. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Because see, unlike the rest of you, I'm a pastor, so I have something I need to do in the morning. Tomorrow is that day. Okay. But listen to me. We paid reparations. The government paid reparations to former enslavers.
To slavers, them too.
It was an apology for taking their slaves away.
right.
You're gonna take ownership corporately for that, but not for the act of enslaving them in the first place.
Hey, matter of fact, hey, I'm gonna write your sermon for you tomorrow, man. Like, we talking about that selective we. You know who I'm glad doesn't think like that on that selective we type of a vantage point? I'm glad God doesn't think that way.
Goodness.
Because we weren't in the garden, at least as we are now. We weren't in the garden when Adam messed up. But we also wasn't on the cross, right? You know, when Jesus, you know, took the punishment for our sin. And we weren't there when that stone was rolled away and he got up early Sunday morning. But I'm so glad that God doesn't think like a modern white evangelical conservative who's taking his orders from Thomas Sowell. I'm so glad that we, I'm included in the right kind of we. You know what I mean? We don't have to be selected that way. I'm just saying.
I'm sorry.
It's all good. It's all good.
I'm trying to tell you.
Let me jump in.
If I was Eric Mason, I would have preached it to you.
So first thing I want to point out is, I find it kind of trite. I heard Sean McDowell. He used this analogy of the parable of the talents as a case for disparities, where that's employment. Those people were employed and given different various amounts of work. It has nothing to do with their actual incomes and outcomes and disparity. So first of all, because he's not the first person
he's been listening to
use that. It's been right, exactly. It was in Voddie's book, it was in a couple other places. So people keep using this analogy, and it just doesn't work. So first of all, you know, that's poor. Secondly, if
the disparity of the talents was based on ethnicity, that would be wrong.
Right.
It's a growth. They're
Exactly.
grasping at something that should never touch. If we had a biblical example of there be a disparity of talents, the disparity of salaries based on the ethnicity of the individual, that would be the Bible recording an evil incident.
Exactly. But it's the parable, if memory serves me correct, it says he gave each according to their ability. And so this is more, their capacity. So, but again, it has nothing to do with how much each one of these guys earned. That's not the point of the parable, and you can only assume based on such. So anyway, I just think that's a poor analogy to use. Secondly, is as you guys have already kind of pointed out, but I want to reiterate, is it drives me nuts that so many Christians are doing commentary on justice, and I have yet to hear one single time mishpat or diakosune, right? I don't hear them using the actual biblical terms, and right behind that is I don't see them. They always go to this Exodus, Leviticus. They go to one single example when the Bible, as Matthew pointed out, is robust. It's replete with contextualized pictures of what constitutes mishpat and diakosune. Here's one of my books, right? Social Critique by Israel's 8th century prophets, Justice and Righteousness in Context. So who were Israel's 8th century prophets? That was Amos, that was Hosea, that was Isaiah, that's Micah. What are some of the things that they talked about? Well, Amos talked about paying people fairly over in Amos 2, 6 and 7. He talked about giving people fair treatment in their criminal justice system in Amos 5. How about Micah talked about people stealing people's houses? Micah 2, 1 and 2. Woe to those who plan iniquity, to those who plot on evil their beds at morning's light. They carry it out because it is in their power to do it. They covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them. They defraud people of their homes. They rob them of their inheritance. So home ownership is something that even is a justice issue, according to the Bible. You go to Isaiah chapter 1, you're oppressing. Oh, there's that word. Is Yahweh an intersectionality because he labels people in swaths of groups? No, it's because that's how descriptive language works. If a group of people, if Ford builds a car that has a flaw and it caused people harm, then we're going to talk about Ford as the entity that's causing this, and Ford is going to be responsible and liable for some of what the outcomes that happen to that. So I don't understand why so many Christians are not realizing that they are talking about justice, but they don't go to the Bible to robustly define it. They get this one example that I'm going to wager that this is an example that they already probably believe constituted justice. And then maybe some commentator used it, and I found my Bible verse. And so now you just keep, and that's why you hear this parable of talents. That's why you keep hearing the same Bible verse out of Leviticus referenced by the various commentators that are Christian commentators that are you talking about justice, and you don't get a robust definition of justice. And if you don't have this robust definition of justice, then maybe you aren't talking about biblical justice. Maybe you're talking about modern, Western, American. Maybe you're talking about justice from some other social context, certainly not biblical. Go ahead and jump on that. And I got another, I want to finish my last.
I'm gonna say it for you, Chris. I know I'm gonna say it for you. It's kind of crazy to me. You could write a whole book about on social justice. You know what I'm saying? Fault lines. You can write a whole book and still not define justice in those pages. That's kind of strange.
And it wasn't just him. I've read about 4 or 5 of them books, and none of them are defining. None of them are talking about diakosune or mishpat. They're all just saying justice in Leviticus, justice and retributive justice. Oh my goodness! I got more.
Chris, you got to say it like this.
Right
now, one of them saying it.
Like now, what I'm saying. Hold on, take that down. Giving my neighbor, Josh McDowell says, giving my neighbor his due, which is to love him. So when people ask me my view on justice, I say I believe biblical justice and not social justice. So his view of justice is loving your neighbor, right? So that's his, and I'm going to be gracious and grant him that he meant as you love yourself, that he meant that too. He was just shortening it, right? I'm gonna be gracious and grant that. So the question then becomes, well, what constitutes loving your neighbor. I'm glad you asked that. A guy once actually asked Jesus that. It's in Luke chapter 10. It was this rich dude who came to Jesus and said, good rabbi, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, love your father. Jesus gave him a couple of laws. He said, I've done all these since I was a kid. Jesus said, great. Well, go sell all your, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. He says, well, who is your neighbor? And then Jesus tells him the parable of the Good Samaritan and how there's a guy, after all these other religious people who in their society would have been seen as the ideal type of religious people, walks on paths, crosses on the other side of the street, walk on paths. This guy who their society would have seen as sort of like, they would have been sort of racist toward the Samaritan, right? They would have been racist toward this dude. Hey, you're not good enough, right? You're not righteous enough. And this guy picks the guy up, puts him in the inn, pays for it. So it's material. Loving your neighbor is not some platitude, romantic platitude that we all say, yes, I love. No, it's actually what you do. It's actually it's a bunch of different things that you can do which reflect that you actually love your neighbor. So here's another quick example of that. You go over to 1 John. This 1 John 3:14 through 17. It says, we know that we pass from death to life because we love each other. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him. This is how we know this is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? So loving your neighbor as yourself, again, it's not just a platitude. It's actually caring for them on a material level. And ironically, when you listen to the words of Jesus, Jesus is praying things like, give us this day our daily bread and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. You know, he's praying practical social things. That might not recognize that because we might not recognize the terminology within its biblical framing, but that's effectively what Jesus is doing. And when we translate that to if we try to synthesize that and give ourselves some application for that in our modern social context, it has a lot to do with the type of things that we, rightly or wrongly, drop into the bucket of what we call social justice today. Are people being paid fairly? Are people being exploited when it comes to housing? Are people, do people have like actual healthy food in their neighborhoods? Notice there's no Whole Foods in ghettos. Whole Foods are out in the suburbs. They don't offer healthy whole food in this inner city. And so there's a list of broken ways that people in our society that are poor are disenfranchised in comparison to people who live in a higher socioeconomic bracket in our country. We as Christians have a calling to do something about that. As a church, we come together and we should be a lighthouse addressing these types of issues that are, yes, political issues, but guess what? Jesus is a political figure. He's a king with a kingdom, with citizens like us. Anyway, so I think that's another one of the elements of this thing that we have to recognize. Loving your neighbor as yourself, define that. Justice and righteousness, define that. Because I think that once you dig into the biblical data, once you start to process and see what it is, it becomes so much clearer the types of things that we should care about and the types of things that we should not be cavalier when we are talking about. Because God cares deeply. God was judging those people with the 8th century prophets. Jesus was judging Israel when he was speaking to them in his day, and God through his people is still judging today. So there you
go. Oh, I know we got some more clips to get to, but man, that's good, bro.
Amen. What he said.
Amen.
All right, let's keep this train rolling. All right, here we go.
So he's distinguishing between equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes.
I think that's right. And he's making the point that when given equal opportunities, everybody doesn't necessarily want different outcomes. Old and young might want different outcomes. Maybe certain racial groups want different. When we push this social justice agenda, some of our large institutions for medicine and defense are going to suffer. That's one reason Sowell argues. A second one, this is at the end of this book. He just says this. He said, with social justice advocates supposedly concerned with the fate of the poor, it may seem strange that they seem to have paid remarkably little attention to places where the poor have risen out of poverty at a dramatic rate and on a massive scale. That at least raises the question whether the social justice advocates' priorities are the poor themselves, or the social justice advocates' own vision of the world and their own role in that vision. So he's calling certain advocates, saying you claim this is about the poor, but you ignore certain data of means to actually help the poor. Maybe something else is going on here. So according to him, what's at stake with social justice is actually real justice, actually creating a fair society where there's equal opportunity. That's actually what's at stake. And I think he's right.
Yeah, then no.
Can I go first on this one so I can stop? I will actually.
Go ahead, Pastor.
I'll actually be brief.
Sir.
Listen to me. I'm not using language I don't typically use. Okay. I hate this book.
Oh, Lord.
I do. And I'm not saying I hate it because I disagree with it. So I hate it because it's really poorly written. And it is very dangerous because of the one from whom it comes. The standing that person holds. This is a very dangerous book. It will have implications. When you are an educated person and you write a book, and this should not be, I want to say that for the record, but you give a lot of your readers permission to not think. In their minds, I don't have to think because the one who thinks better than me did all the thinking for me. And so some of the conclusions that he comes to here, which are very dangerous, they're going to proliferate because they're now put in the hands of people who give themselves permission to not think. Another problem I had with this is when we were in Philadelphia a few weeks ago, a month ago, how long has it been for the Urban Apologetics Conference? Adam and I were there.
It was February.
It was February. Okay, yeah. Oh my goodness, it's about to be April again. It's about to be April already. So Adam and I were there. Matt and Chris, they played hooky. That's okay because all the cool kids were there. And on the last day, when we were getting ready to go, Shawnee came to me and asked me about a quote from John MacArthur regarding Martin Luther King. And so I went and checked it out. And he outright identifies Martin Luther King as an unbeliever. He's pretty much evaluating him. He's essentially evaluating Martin Luther King as a forerunner to what he would identify as the modern day woke movement. And he says that much of his worldview was in direct opposition to the gospel. It stood in direct opposition to the gospel. When I'm sitting there listening to that, I started my next book proposal the day after that. Shawnee, I think I have to give you a shout out in the next book because I started my next book proposal the day after watching that MacArthur video, because that was the moment I realized that those who take a stand for social justice, which I would argue is biblical justice, the whole discussion regarding biblical justice versus social justice, that's a redefining of our terms, and that's a red herring that's changing the subject and is casting us under a strawman argument. Because we take a stand on social justice that I would identify as biblical, we're now the non-believers. We're now the non-Christians. The worst thing you can do to someone is to say that their biblically defensible applied theology is non-Christian. A man died so that I could go to the seminary I went to, so that I could go to the university I attended, so that I could have the right to vote and live in the house I live in. And he did that he was fueled by the gospel. The civil rights movement is a para-crusade of the Black church. When you call Martin Luther King a non-believer, you are calling into question the salvific walk of millions of people who come out of that same movement. We're the non-Christians now because we took a stand on this. And those who accuse us of being non-Christians are identifying with those who created the unjust circumstances in the first place. That is a dangerous thing. I do not like using rhetoric like this, but Thomas Sowell in this book has given people permission to be dismissive, to ignore the genuine and defensible cries of thinking people. And that is something we should never take lightly. The thing that in that whole clip I just listened to, the thing that Josh McDowell, that Sean McDowell said that caught my attention was, and I agree with him. That was everything around that was just kind of background noise. He said he broke down what Thomas Sowell said, and he concluded with, and I agree with him. There's an entire and Sean McDowell is not an old man. We can often find ourselves being dismissive of John MacArthur because John MacArthur's next birthday of note will take him into a decade that most people do not enter. We're thinking he's going to die soon. No. He has children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who are his theological progeny who are carrying it along. Sean McDowell is my age. And hearing him say, and I agree with him, lets me know I will be dealing with this foolishness for the rest of my life. And that is disheartening. I hate this book, not because of its content, and it's very poorly written, but because of the damage it's going to do in the church and nationally as we're trying to maintain a witness to a generation that is progressively turning away from us and turning toward the de-churched identity because of foolishness like this.
Bars, man. And I just want to offer this up too, just to co-sign what you said. I think that interestingly enough, in this book here, Thomas Sowell has a term that he uses. I hope I get it right, that I think actually can be appropriated to describe what you're talking about, the notion of a surrogate decision maker, a surrogate decision maker. And so he makes this whole argument about how essentially progressives take freedoms out of the hands of the people and are kind of like paternalistically, making decisions for everybody else. So at least that's what the social justice agenda they would want to accomplish, I should say. And this notion that they're taking freedom away and taking decision-making power away. I think similarly, my fear, and my concern is that, people like Thomas Sowell and I'll just, and secular political conservatives are slowly becoming like the surrogate thinkers and decision makers with respect to some of my brothers and sisters in Christ. Like, we're abdicating our responsibility to think clearly and do justice. And instead we're following the ideas of Soulites, Thomas Sowell and the like. And we're gonna end up, well, actually, I say we're gonna end up, but I think the result has been and is a hardening of the heart that comes out in how we love one another within the body of Christ and interact with those who are outside the body. I think that's what's going on right now. So, yeah.
So the question that they're asking is, why do disparities matter? Why do they actually matter, right? I would say this. I would say that if you pay attention to the Bible, that what God is doing is profoundly social. And this goes back to my earlier comment about the King Jesus gospel versus other paradigms. And not that the King Jesus gospel is the end all be all. It's just a way. It's one that I've encountered that is helpful in contextualizing some of these things, that when you have other primary orientation, things like the social aspect of the Bible gets kind of marginalized, left out, or people don't think about it or cultivate or synthesize, orthopraxy and theology as much or as well. So, yeah. You know what? I've heard another trite comment that I often hear from people. They didn't say it in this video, but I often hear from people that are kind of advancing similarly as they are in this book is, Jesus said the poor will always be with you. Which is true. Jesus did say the poor was always, but that wasn't a notion that was intended to say don't worry about the poor. It had a context, which I'm not going to get into now. Here's what people often miss. Like Yahweh said in Deuteronomy 15:4, however, there need be no poor people among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you. So when you look at what God was doing with Israel, God made them a nation of priests. He was using them, and he had given them this land that was a prosperous land so that they could reflect what God is offering people. Hey, come under the rule of Yahweh, and under the rule of Yahweh is justice. If you go back and look at the Torah and you look at the laws for justice, it's like there's these cities where if you are in a case where there's a murder that's taking place and you don't want to be killed by the people, you can go to these cities of refuge where you're going to receive protection and you're going to receive a fair case. There's all these laws in Israel's law, and it's like, have you ever asked yourself, like, what's the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Because we have these very like notions like, oh, the laws is done away with. But have you ever asked yourself what was the purpose of the law? The purpose of the law was so that God's people, who were designed to be a light to the nations, who were designed to draw other nations in, could reflect what it looks like to live under God's rule. That's where all the laws and stuff are there. So when you get to the New Testament, what's really going on is in the Old Covenant, you have to be a natural descendant of Abraham, or you have to like proselytize and participate in these feast, festivals, circumcision, dietary laws. There was like these practices that you had to participate in. New Testament seems to be saying, well, feast, festivals, circumcision, these practices that were prerequisites of you participating in the old way no longer exist, and that now you can participate through Christ, pledging allegiance to Christ. Now you can participate through that. You don't have to worry about these other little caveats. So that would assume, one would assume that, okay, well, God still requires justice. As a matter of fact, when you think about the gospel is introduced as a message about a kingdom being established. And Jesus is the Christ. He's the Messiah, or he's the anointed one. He's the king. He's this political ruling figure. So something very similar is going on in the New Testament, Old Testament. And that's why when Jesus says, I come that you might have life and that more abundantly, disparities matter because Jesus came that we might have abundant life. Disparities matter. Like, and if it's not clear, go look at Matthew 25, where Jesus does the parable of the sheep and the goat. And he starts to list off the things that he, as a ruler, when he's assessing and judging the people who follow him and participate in his kingdom, when he starts listing the things that he actually cares about. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was in prison, did you visit me? When I was sick, did you take it? To the least of these that you did to people in my kingdom, you did. It's just like you did it to me. All of those things we would throw in a social justice bucket today. We would question where those things, the significance of them, and where they lie in the scope of what is important within Christianity today. But it seems essential enough that Jesus is using it in a parable about how things are what's going to be factored in when things play out in the end. When Jesus opens the scroll of Isaiah and reads, I'm the fulfillment of the acceptable year of the Lord, the year of Jubilee in Luke chapter 2. It's easy to assume, that some of the things that he's talking about in there are liberation and oppression. It's easy to assume that those things have different connotations to them that are not, practical. Not a person who's literally in jail, or not a person who's literally being oppressed in the sense of economic or, upward mobility in a society. But if you just go one chapter back to chapter 3 of Luke, where John the Baptist is on the scene, when John the Baptist starts preaching the message of repentance, what is John the Baptist talking about? He says, he who has 2 cloaks should give to him who have none. He who has food should do likewise. He says, don't take too much taxes. Don't be a corrupt police officer, Roman soldier. These are the things, again, things that we would throw into social justice buckets. If you simply pay attention. I already read 1 John chapter 3 earlier, where if you don't share your material goods, I don't have to go into James chapter 2, where he's critiquing rich people and telling them the same thing. Have not God chosen the poor of this world to inherit the kingdom of God? It's right there in front of you. Christianity is a social paradigm from Genesis to Revelation. Revelation, it ends with, now I saw the new heavens and new earth coming down. Now the dwelling place of God was with man. Then it goes into streets of gold, rivers, trees that produce fruit all year round. Walmart. So a tree that produces fruit all year round means that there's always food available. We miss the picture of social justice. We misplace social justice. And I would argue that many Christians, and my suspicion is that's true of Josh McDowell, based on the way that he talks about this. I hope I'm wrong, but that's just my suspicion, is that he embraces a gospel that basically boils down to some form of Platonism. That, hey, Our goal is to receive salvation of our souls and ultimately end up in the presence of God. It's not for God's presence to come down here to earth and to rule in such a way that we all can experience it right here, right now. So I'm gonna end with this last verse right here. It's in the Gospel of Mark. I think it's chapter 10. Matter of fact, I'm just gonna kind of quote it off the dome. So he says, "No one who's left mothers, fathers, sister, brother, houses, homes, for me and the sake of the kingdom will fail to receive 100 times that mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, houses, homes, along with persecution, and in this age and in the age to come, eternal life." He said, "Will fail receive 100 times that in this age." Speaking to his contemporaries, hey, you follow me, there's benefits right here, right now to following me, and it's going to culminate with eternal life. So really, we Christians have to pay more attention to the scriptures. We have to maybe reconsider the paradigm that we have embraced, where we think what the scriptures is getting at, what we think constitutes salvation. Salvation starts right here, right now, and continues through all of eternity.
That's good.
We have to embrace the right here, right now, as we've embraced the eternity. And the right here, right now has something to do with loving your neighbor as yourself, which is very practical, which is very material. And yes, it delves into secular politics also. The problem comes when you want to abdicate your duty to the secular politicians. If you want them to solve the problems that God called you to solve, because we the kingdom. We're supposed to be representing God and doing these things. And if we see ourselves as the solution, we don't have to worry about the secular folks. Yeah, we can still commentate on it and we can still cast votes, but we don't hope in those things. That's the problem. We hope in those things, and we have a gospel that is so mischaracterized that we don't realize that we are working against our very Lord.
And I think, just to add on to that real quick is that, part of the problem, again, trying to find points of agreement. I agree with Sean McDowell. Yes, I'm for biblical justice too. 100%. Absolutely.
Yes.
My concern is that when I take, to borrow from what you said, Chris, a robust look at the scriptures, what the scriptures have to say from Genesis to Revelation in terms of what justice is, and then I articulate that, what's happening is that my Christian, fellow Christians out here, they're saying, "Oh no, that's social justice." I'm like, no, I'm communicating biblical justice, and you don't recognize it because you have an impoverished view of biblical justice. That's my concern, right? You're calling it what you're calling social justice many times, not all the time, because I do believe that term social justice has been in many ways hijacked by the left. I'll just put it that way. But I'm just saying that there is an articulation of biblical justice, right, that is being mishandled and called social justice. And I think it's partly because many of our contemporaries just flat out don't recognize biblical justice when they see it. And I know that's harsh, but I just think it's true. I think it's true.
I believe the gospel is innately social. So to try to make a distinction between social justice and biblical justice is it's a fool's errand. So I think that we have to be careful with stuff like that. Chris, you said something that I think that contributes to that problem. I think that, again, I don't want to speak for Sean McDowell. The reason I default to Josh McDowell whenever that name comes up is a ready defense was fundamental to my conversion. I'm one of those people for whom apologetics played a role prior to me actually converting. I'm one of those rare birds. So, in the book I read, the first Christian book I ever read was written by Josh McDowell. So to have heard the quote that he put out a couple years ago, and then to hear Sean McDowell using this rhetoric here is troubling to me. But I want to build upon something Chris said. Then I'm the one who keeps saying I have to go because tomorrow, because he gets up in the morning. Tomorrow is early on Sunday morning. And I'm also the one who keeps us long. Chris, often unwittingly, the church is Platonist. We have this emphasis on the immaterial part of who we are. We think that the gospel is Jesus died so that the soulish part of me can have a place to go when I die. We co-opted that. The Enlightenment was a resurgence. It was a renaissance, literally a renaissance of very old ideas, and Enlightenment Christian thinkers Christianized the works of Aristotle and Plato. It's the reason slavery had a role in the lives of Reformed era, post-Reformed era thinkers like Jonathan Edwards and Charles Whitefield. We think in terms of Jesus died on the cross, I will have a place to go when I die. The notion that the gospel has real world implications for us right now, in the real world here and now, is something that we give very little thought to. So we'll see someone enduring hardship, and we think our only job is to love them, to encourage them while they endure the hardship. The idea of us putting ourselves under the wheels that are injuring them, to block the carriages running them over, is a foreign idea to us. And the reason we don't think in those terms in America is because we identify with the people who are often responsible for the injustice that we're discussing. We identify. We carved George Washington's face into the side of a mountain. We carved Thomas Jefferson's face into the side of a mountain. Andrew Jackson's responsible for the deaths of thousands of indigenous Americans. And we put his face on our currency, and we celebrate him at every given opportunity. When you identify with the terrorist, you are slow to see terrorism. That's the complication we're dealing with here. And we will look at a person who's enduring terrorism and say, Jesus died, so one day in the sweet by and by, you will be delivered from this. And the notion that the gospel has implications on the present here and now, that's something we dismiss, because if we own the fact that there's brokenness in the present here and now that's in need of the gospel's impact, then we would have to concede that our heroes were terrorists. Selah.
Yeah, we got a guy right now running for election selling Bibles out here. You know, with the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence,
sold into it.
You know, you talking about selling the Bible with the prologue, you know, or whatever the word, the Declaration, the same Declaration of Independence that refers to indigenous people as savages. We're going to package that with the Bible, with the Word of God. And we got to listen. Come on, man.
That was the moment when I saw. See, I have to go. Come
on, man.
When I saw that ad, that was the moment I said, okay, we're saying the quiet part out loud. We're selling the Bible, and to it we have added the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the preamble. We're using national documents. We're treating national documents as on a shelf, even remotely close to Scripture. If you ever wanted to see an example of Christian nationalism, the idolatry of nationalism on display, remember the day when we took the national founding documents and packaged them in proximity to Scripture. So what the readers are going to do now is they're going to read the Bible from the perspective of, through the hermeneutic of those founding documents. We have completely driven this train off the rails. And I'm going to tell you something, when Christ comes back, that's going to come up.
Stop it, Reverend.
You're not going to be happy, Doc.
Reverend, we
told y'all when we was at the Urban Apologetics Conference, I said during that, I told y'all that America was birthed out of syncretism. Like it was present at its being. If that's not syncretism, I don't know what is. If that's not, come on, man.
We got to get you out of here, Reverend.
My wife is texting me right now saying, you do know you have to be at church at 7 o'clock.
Tell
her hello.
Washington, it was not my fault.
Right.
Okay. So let me go ahead and just say this. I would like to do a part 2. Okay. Sure. So I'm going to be coordinating once again and working with everybody's schedule to get something on each of y'all calendars. It's I don't have an administrative assistant, so I kind of got to do all this myself.
And this was like herding cats. I feel bad for you.
That's okay. We're going to get it done because there are other portions that we want to talk about. Thomas Sowell makes the assertion that a person would need to basically be omniscient in order to try to do justice, And there's a lot of absurdities in there. But just before we go, because Sean McDowell also says nobody interacts with Thomas Sowell. So here's one book written by Steven Steinberg called The Ethnic Myth. Okay, it's by Steven Steinberg. He also wrote this book right here called The Counter Revolution, The Crusade to Roll Back the Gains of the Civil Rights Movement. Steven Steinberg. That's another book y'all can get since nobody interacts with Thomas Sowell.
What's the scholar from Duke that talks about reparations? Darity. Doesn't he interact? Darity. Don't he interact with Thomas Sowell too?
Yeah, he does. And
it's called William Darity, I think.
That book is from Here to Freedom by William Darity. Yeah. And this book right here by Thomas D. Boston, Race, Class, and Conservatism.
I have that one.
Please get it. Dr. McDowell, Dr. Sean McDowell, please get this. If you don't get any book that I just mentioned, get this book right here, because this guy, he really interacts with Thomas Sowell. I would say he takes him apart.
Yeah, I do have that one.
I would say that he takes him apart. So I will post more resources, because it doesn't stop there. I will post more resources and attach them to this video, because people do interact with the popular level writer, Dr. Thomas Sowell. Yeah. They do interact with him, but his stuff is popular level. So with that being said, I just want to thank all of you wonderful preachers and theologians and practitioners of justice for coming on my channel and interacting with this video. I know it probably got some people's blood boiling, but I appreciate y'all for doing it. Chris, what you got?
Okay, so real quick, Sean McDowell, over the past 4 or 5 years, you've been interviewing people and you've been like investigating CRT, social justice, and a few other topics, along those lines. And so from as an outside observer, I feel like you're biased towards the people who maybe you share more views with, share more beliefs with and such. But honestly, I think that the people who are going to help the most is the people who you don't share views with, because no one's going to help you to think more critically about your views than the person who's actually criticizing it. And with that in mind, I just want to encourage you, and get a Brandon Washington on and to ask some questions, or even have conversation with people like him offline. I can give you a list of people that you can have conversations with offline. First of all, any of us, we're more happy because we're not in it for the money. We're not in it for the press. We actually care about the kingdom and the people, and we want to be of help. One of the biggest problems I think with this discussion is often people on your side of the aisle are the side that have the money. And I don't mean that for us. I just mean like that's a factor in how these things play out. Because we're not asking for money. I'm simply saying those people, shut the other side off, and our side of the equation are like, hey, let's come to the table. So I just want to encourage you. I talked to I reached out to Monique Desan the other day, and I said, hey, let's have a conversation, because she did a video and she's like, I want to talk to somebody about biblical justice. So I said, I'll come talk about biblical justice, and we don't have to talk online. We can talk offline, because my goal is not to gain notoriety. I love my anonymity. So I don't want to be famous. That said, I care very much about the kingdom, and more of these conversations need to happen. We need more critical conversations, both offline and on. So I just want to encourage you, reach out, get some recommendations on some critical thinkers that are devoutly Christian, and start having conversations with those people. Because right now, the more these videos come out, and this video in particular, it's deeply saddening to hear what you're being influenced by, and knowing how those ideas are so anti-Christian. And I say that with all due respect. Those ideas are anti-Christian, and you are pushing that out to God's people. So thanks.
Adam, just wanted to offer you to go ahead, sir.
I'm gonna take my seat here because I want Adam to close this. I want to close this out. But let me tell you something. The highlight of my day is, without me prompting you, all three of you took my book off a shelf behind you, and I'm surrounded by readers right now. And all of you had it within arm's reach, and I have no copy of that book anywhere now around me anywhere. So it made my day that I sold at least 3 copies of that book.
So I ended up with 5 copies because originally I wanted a signed copy, and I ended up buying 2 copies to give away. And then I bought another copy to get signed, and then I got 2 extra copies at the retreat in Nashville because you had a couple extras with you. So I got 2 other copies to give away from that. I ended up with five copies of the book that were actually paid for.
My editor thanks you. My editor, as do I.
Yeah, I'll be brief, man. And it's a phenomenal book. If you don't have A Burning House, I'll be your promoter, man. If you don't have A Burning House by Brandon Washington, you need this book. It is he's as intellectual as they come, but it's also just extremely accessible, very, very accessible. And I feel like he says a lot. You say me, at least I would love to write something like this. You know what I mean? Yeah, I got to step my game up and figure out what I'm doing, man. But anyway. Let me say this. Let me say this, man, as we get up out of here. This honestly is somewhat of an anomaly for me. Like, we spend most of our time combating anti-Christian perspectives, worldviews, groups from within the African-American context, whether it be Hebrew Israelites, Comedics, so on and so forth. I got tons of criticism for, the political left. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm well documented on speaking against, the left. And so this is not like some sort of, we hate white evangelicals and we're just more Black than we are Christian. We're more Christian than we are Black. We're more Christian than we are American. And I think that what happens is when I see people in the public square who really hold sway over the minds of fellow Christians who just fundamentally, don't know Jesus and pushing ideas that make it evident that they don't. And, my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ are just imbibing it. That troubles me deeply. That troubles me deeply. When I read Thomas Sowell's work and it's just the naturalistic underpinnings of his ideology and methodology are just dripping off the page at certain points. I don't understand. I genuinely don't understand why a Christian, with a platform, a large platform, would promote something like that. I genuinely don't understand. But I think it's a travesty. We have to do better. Like, we should not be the caboose in these conversations. We, meaning the kingdom people, need to be driving the train, of what justice looks like and so on and so forth. And, we got to get guys like Thomas Sowell out of the pilot seat. We got to do that. We're really giving a black eye, I think, to the kingdom. And I think we can do better. So I'm gonna just camp out there. I would love to come back for a volume 2 of this right here. Love sharing time and just hearing the insights from my brothers, you know what I mean? And it's crazy, Chris, you talked about there's 10-20 people in the chat right now that Sean McDowell could have conversation with. It's not just about us. I mean, there are a number of us out here, who could have meaningful conversations, and I think he would come away with it. I love Sean McDowell as an apologist. I think he's done a phenomenal job of pushing the gospel, and I just hope that he doesn't just damage his witness by promoting works that are clearly antithetical to that gospel that he's been making an apology for. So that's all I got to say, and appreciate you, MJ.
Just one quick comment. We don't want any money. I just want to make sure that's real clear. We don't want any money, because I made a comment, and we don't want any fame. We just want to we love to help by having a conversation, even offline, to at least give you some critical feedback on what it seems like you're pressing in these videos that you've been doing on the subjects.
I prefer the first conversation be offline, in fact.
Exactly. So we get rapport.
Well, with that being said, go ahead. Adam, you got something?
No, I'm saying I agree. As far as the offline, like, it doesn't have to be online. Like, I mean, yeah, I agree.
With that being said, we will be working to see if we can facilitate a part 2, because I think this is important. I mean, Thomas Sowell is that dude that gets thrown up in conversations frequently, and I think it's worth attending to. So I just want to thank each and every one of you guys for sharing your precious time on this channel, and I believe that this has blessed quite a few people who will watch it. Just to those who are watching, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and also hit that like button and just be on the lookout for more content like this. Peace.
Peace.